And so, moving right along here through Joseph Campbell's Masks of God, Volume 1, Primitive Mythology. Last time we were looking at the psychology of myth, the psychodynamics of how myth functions, which is part 1 of the book, The Psychology of Myth. And we looked at, last time, the lesson of the mask and the enigma of the inherited image, which has to do with the a priori aspects of myth. And in this next very long chapter, chapter 2 of this section, called The Imprints of Experience, Campbell goes into and deals with the empirical aspects of myth, the aspects of myth that have to do with things that are imprinted upon the human psyche a posteriori, but that nevertheless are universal. He is only really interested here in this chapter in those aspects of the human experience that are universal. And myth works with these motifs and amplifies them, pictorializes them, and works them into ritual. And what he does is he goes through the basic stages of the human life cycle in this chapter, starting with what he calls the structuring force of life on Earth as one of the basic universal imprints, the fact that we're on this planet. No matter where on the planet you are at, there are certain universals that have to be experienced and gone through, one of which is simply waking up every day. Everyone has to wake up every day, and the association of waking with the rising sun is universal. So that's imprint number 1 that goes across the board. Number 2 is also having to deal with the night sky, the moon and its relationship to the night sky, and the effect of the moon on the tides of the earth, and its correlation with the female menstrual cycle. All of these processes are also universal imprints of experience. They're not innate releasing mechanisms. They're out there, but nonetheless universal. And the fact, too, of the obvious difference anatomically between the sexes, which is also a universal imprint of experience. But then what he does is, what he goes into detail in here are the, he divides the human life cycle up essentially into 3 stages. And he says that from 0 to 20, you're in a stage of dependency, psychological dependency, which requires supervision by parental authorities. In the stage from 20 to 40, this is the stage of competence in the achievement of mastery in some discipline or domain, some aspect of life. And then from 40 to the end of life and death, you're dealing with old age and having to deal with the inevitability of the approach of death. So he's got these 3 stages. But then he goes through and he talks about the first stage here, the imprints of early infancy. And so here in this subsection, he's only concerned really with the age from 0 to about 6 years old, where he says there are 5 constellations of imprints that every infant, more or less across the globe, has to deal with. The first is, of course, the birth trauma. This is also universal. Everyone has to go through the birth trauma. Stanislav Grof was the psychologist who went through and elucidated the birth trauma and said that there are 4 distinct stages to the birth trauma, which he called perinatal matrices. And each one of these stages has a distinct psychology associated with it that later on in life the individual can get stuck in. The first matrix is that simply of being in the Neptunian state, the oceanic state of the embryo in the mother womb, this state of oceanic unity. But the onset of the trauma itself initiates the second stage, where the water breaks, but the cervix has not opened yet, even though contractions are pushing. And so this is the second matrix, and this can give a sense of the individual as being stuck in a no-exit situation. This can lead to later, if the adult gets stuck in this stage later on, it can lead to an unnecessary degree of pessimism in life, in the feeling that one is constantly getting stuck in situations that have no escape, no exit. The third matrix is the actual movement through the birth canal of the infant, struggling as it goes through and experiences suffocation as it switches its mode of breathing from the amniotic fluid to the air. Later on in life, this can lead, if one has this reactivated later on in life, can lead to a state of everything is constantly a struggle, a fight. And then finally the breakthrough. The 4th matrix is simply the coming out into the air and the breakthrough. So Campbell says this is the first imprint of experience, and subsequent situations, he doesn't mention Grof here, but he says that the subsequent situations, any life crisis situation can activate the shortness of breath, fainting, anxiety attacks. Those are all reactivations of the birth trauma. And so the second experience then is the infant's experience with the mother's breast and the nourishment that it gains therefrom from the mother's breast. And when it is separated from that constant state of ambrosial milk and nourishment, the anxiety create a problem later on. And so the first two of these imprints of experience have to do then with the
infant's relationship to the mother's body. The third imprint of experience comes in at about the age of 2.5 to 3 years old, when the infant is fascinated with its own excrement. And the fascination with its own excrement is something that obviously has to be controlled carefully, but it's not something that can be wiped out. It gets repressed, and perhaps later in culture is sublimated in anything that has to do perhaps with the making of things, the creation of art. All of that, at least from the Freudian point of view, is the sublimation of the infant's fascination with excrement. Making things out of clay and sculpture, smearing paint, anything that has to do with smearing, making, and so forth. Or later in later religions, in Hindu religion, the smearing of the body with gray ash, all those kinds of things may actually be sublimations later on of this what he calls this third constellation of imprints. The fourth constellation of imprints then has to do with, at about the age of 4 or 5, the infant becomes aware of the differences anatomically between the male and female anatomy. And this is experienced, at least according to Freud, from the point of view of the male as the fear of castration, and from the point of view of the female as penis envy, which apparently she will suffer from for the rest of her life until she has her own child. And the male deals with the fact of the sight of the vagina as a missing penis, and activates in him the fear that this could possibly happen to himself. So there's that. Then the fifth constellation of the imprints of experience is the first one that introduces the father, and this is, of course, the Freudian Oedipus complex, the family romance in which the male child wants to eliminate the father and be alone with the mother. And it experiences fear of the father's ogre-like aggressive castration or punishment as the fear of a potential castration from the father, whereas the girl experiences the Electra complex, where she sees herself as a rival of her mother for her father's attentions. So these are the 5 basic imprints of infantile experience that Campbell sees happening from 0 to 6. And then he has this next subchapter where he talks about the psychology of the spontaneous animism of childhood, which has to do with the psychology of children between the ages of 6 and 12 years old, where the child begins to experience a certain degree of intellect, a certain degree of ability to think and wonder about things, and basically becomes a sort of primitive metaphysician or an infantile metaphysician, and begins to start asking questions like, where do things come from? Where does the universe come from? Where do I come from? And very often will spontaneously supply answers, such as the universe, who made the universe. There's always a sense in which the child tends to assume that everything has been made by someone or something else. Who made the planet? Where did the first people come from? And so forth and so on. There are all these, except that it tends to project animism onto and through everything, except that it tends to think of children as having been found. Who found me? Where did I come from? Who found me? And there's always this sense that the infant is found somewhere. So he goes through the psychology briefly of the child as a sort of primitive metaphysician. But then he goes in the next section to deal with what he talks about as the transition of the child into adulthood, subsection 5 here, on the system of sentiments of the local group, and he goes at length through an analysis of an Australian Aboriginal puberty ritual, a ceremony that marks the transition of the male child from infancy to a state of maturity as an adult. And it's a process that's undergone over a period of a few weeks, and it begins with the child being abducted by a group of men who will just come in unexpectedly one night and grab him and take him out into the desert. And there he is put through an ordeal
which involves fasting, punishment, and eventually circumcision. Circumcision is practiced, the foreskin is cut off, that is practiced, and then the child's body is smeared with blood and is only fed on the blood of men. The men cut themselves and they pour their blood into bowls and they feed the child, and the child is only allowed over a period of days to drink the blood from the fathers. And so we begin to get a sense here in which we see that those initial imprints of experience are reactivated and reconstellated in this initiation ritual, where they're reorganized. Deleuze and Guattari would say they're re-territorialized in such a way as to become properly affective, structuring imprints upon the individual that are now reactivated and help him get across that difficult threshold from childhood to maturity. For instance, the birth matrix is reactivated, obviously, in the whole trauma of the experience. The child's relationship then to the mother's breast now is re-territorialized as the blood that he is fed by the men. The men nourish him now. He is nourished not on mother's milk, but on men's blood, and from here on out. And the excrement, the child's fascination with smearing of its excrement is reactivated with the bodies being smeared with blood. And then, of course, the circumcision ritual is the castration motif returns with the punishment of the father, the aggressive, ogre-like father who brings now a punishment to the child, but in the form of an initiation that gets him across the difficult threshold. Campbell says that in modern civilization and modern societies which are based on literacy, everything takes place through learning and education. But the problem with that is it's not quite as decisive and definite as having your whole body altered and being put through an ordeal. In many cases, then you wind up with individuals in contemporary civilization who never, with significant portions of their psyche remaining fixated on a state of childhood dependency. So we get the psychological neurotic weeping on the psychoanalyst's couch with different portions of his psyche still stuck in infancy because there is no real initiation ceremony that decisively marks the crisis of transition in such a way that these Aboriginal societies had. And so the second phase of the Aranda initiation is that of subincision. A much more painful process takes place where the young initiate is taken out and his penis is sliced open right along the underside of the urethra with a flint blade, sliced right open, and it bleeds. And basically then what this is, Campbell says, is the male appropriation of the bleeding vagina. The bleeding vagina is a considerable cause of castration on the part of men, and here that fear is neutralized by the men appropriating the bleeding vagina so that they have the female power now with them. So that they're not children anymore, but they're not entirely male either in making the transition. They're both, there's a bisexual metaphysical motif here of the bisexual being that Campbell amplifies by saying that there's this, though this is psychological as far as the right's purpose goes to neutralize the fear of castration anxiety, nonetheless, there's a metaphysical dimension to it that can be found in a number of the world's great myths, cosmogonic myths of a bisexual or androgynous being who was there at the beginning of creation. For instance, in the case of Adam, before the rib is taken from his side, he is basically in a state of androgyny. Or in Plato's myth in the Timaeus, in which humans began as, in the beginning as male-male. They were essentially joined together as male-males, female-females, and male-females, and the creator being sliced each one of these in half. The male-males and the female-females are sliced in half to represent homosexuality, lesbian homosexuality and male homosexuality, and then the male-female beings are sliced in half to explain why the sexes want to constantly come back together again to reconstruct that initial androgynous bisexual unity. Then he also says to compare this with the creation myth in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad of the primordial self that was neither male nor female in the beginning and was alone. And because of its loneliness, it had the desire to create another, and so it sort of mitotically split in half and created a male-female pair. They mate together, they change form into different animals and mate and produce all the animals of creation. And Campbell says, note that with the two Western, with the examples of the Hebrew myth and the myth from the Timaeus, the human being is split apart by a God who is separate from them, whereas in the case of what we'll go into in a second with the Australian creation myth and the Hindu creation myth, the being simply multiplies itself. So he says the Iran to have a primordial creation myth that illustrates what's going on in the sub-incision performance where they appropriate the bleeding vagina, is that in the beginning there was a primary being lying underneath the earth named Karora, and this being was asleep underneath the earth, and a pole had grown up out of its head, thrust through the earth, a pole made out of flesh, which Campbell says is analogous to the penis, the erect penis that is sliced through the sub-incision ceremony. And it's underneath the ground, and there are red flowers over the earth, and it starts giving birth spontaneously, this being does, to bandicoots. Bandicoots are sort of marsupial-like Australian creature. This is from the Bandicoot Aranda tribe. And from its navel spring up all these bandicoots, and they crawl up through the surface of the earth, and then the being Karora detaches the pole from its head and climbs up out of the ground as well. It finds itself lacking nourishment, falls back into the earth, and then produces from underneath one of its arms a being that first begins as a bull roarer and then gradually takes shape as the first human being, which then comes up out of the earth. And so there again we see the bisexual motif. Campbell points out, notice this idea that the pole or the tree growing from the skull invites a certain comparison to Christ crucified on the cross, the world tree that was very often in medieval art depicted as growing from the skull of Adam. Adam is the skull from whence the second tree upon which Christ is crucified has grown. So he amplifies the myth with a number of things. But he basically says that, so there's this metaphysical idea in these puberty rites and ritual ceremonies that link the individual to cosmic prototypes of androgynous beings. And so the initiation rite is finished, and that's Campbell's illustration of this transition that is necessary for the individual to cross psychologically, and that myths originally helped for. In this chapter, he's talking about the psychological and sociological functions of myth. Later on, he'll elaborate more on the cosmological and metaphysical functions of myth. And then in the final section here, dealing with the life cycle, we have, of course, old age and death. And he quotes Jung to the effect that Jung says that it is necessary, it's good psychic hygiene for us to believe in the afterlife. It's good for older people to believe that they're going to be reborn into another world, whether true or not. It's just good psychic hygiene for them to get over this threshold. And he says that there must be a reason why the human species grows older into their 70s and 80s, or it wouldn't do it if there wasn't some reason for it. And he says that basically, whereas the younger generations are associated with health, wealth, and progeny, that is to say with nature, animal reproduction, and survival of the species, the elderly or the older generation is associated with culture. Universally, the older folks, the elders, are the ones who are in charge of the religious forms of the culture. They're the ones in charge of the myths and symbols of the gateway, crossing into the other world. And Campbell finishes the chapter by setting us up for the discussion for the rest of the book, which will be about the two different types of primitive worship, what he calls the way of the animal powers, the hunters, or the way of the seeded earth, the planters, and says that Leo Frobenius identified two different modes of death where the dead are either feared or revered. In the case of the hunters, they are feared. The way of life of hunters is based on violence. Animals are constantly being killed. People die in hunting accidents or killed by rival tribes, or if they do die, their deaths are blamed on the magic of other shamans. So death is never really natural. It's always violent. And there's a consequent fear of the dead in these societies. The dead are buried. Their arms are either bound up or heavy rocks are put on their graves, as in the case of the Palestinian Natufians, who did indeed bury their dead and their shamans by putting huge rocks on their graves so that they cannot get back up again. Whereas he says, contrast this with the attitude of reverence for the ancestral dead amongst the planters, amongst the Neolithic planting societies and the tropical planting societies, where the dead is buried and then the skull is dug back up, painted, and is happily included in the tribe, along with all the decision-making events, so the dead are incorporated into the tribe, and we get the appearance of the cult of the ancestral dead, the reverence and worship of the ancestors that will be typical of what he calls the mystical function of death, whereas with the hunters, it's magical. And so that's the end of this very long and interesting chapter, which Campbell sets us up now for the rest of the book.